When you pray the Lord's Prayer, you come to the phrase, "Give us this day our daily bread." Now, surprising as it may seem, the word daily was not one of the vocabulary words that the translators had heard of. They made a guess as to what they thought it might be, but they weren't sure. And then they uncovered some fragments and discovered the meaning of the word, and you'll never guess where they found it. They found it on some woman's shopping list. The woman, in preparing to go to the market to get the things that she needed, beside every word which was for one of the staple items, such as flour, salt, whatever the things were that were the everyday things you needed in the house, she had written this Greek word which meant daily, that we translate daily. But the word means that which we need not just for today, but for tomorrow and after, the daily staples of life. Jesus had a reason for using that word, our daily bread. Bread for today and tomorrow and after. Bread for going on with. Jesus wanted us to understand that God is concerned about the smallest little details of our lives. There are people who find it hard to believe that it's all right if you lose something to pray and ask for God's help in finding it. Because somehow or other we've got this idea in mind that since God is involved with this gigantic universe and all of these monstrous world problems, how could he possibly have the time or the concern to care about me and the fact that I lost a pair of scissors? But Jesus said, hey, God cares about your ordinary, everyday, daily little things. Jesus tried to get that point across in so many ways. And he was telling us to pray. He said that it's the Father's good pleasure to give us these things we ask for. It pleasures God to help us find a pair of scissors we misplaced, a book that we can't remember where it is and is due at the library. It gives him pleasure when someone is studying for a test to help them grasp the material, understand it, and be able to give it back when they take the test. God cares about our daily bread. And Jesus wanted us to understand that, to get that point across. Now, wrapped up in that is a word which is very, very important. You might call it a key word as far as our lives are concerned, and that word is trust. Trust. Oh, God had worked so hard trying to teach trust to people. And people have such a hard time learning how to trust God. Take these Israelite people when they came out of Egypt. They were hungry, and they cried to God for bread. They didn't have any. There were no supermarkets on the corner in the desert where they could go and get something. And God said that he would provide them with manna to eat. And then he cautioned them. He said, gather only as much as you'll eat that day. Do not try to gather any more. Do not try to save it till the next day. And yet, you know, there are some people who couldn't believe that because God gave it to them today, that he would also give it to them tomorrow? They couldn't trust God to keep his word. And so they tried to gather up more. And that which they gathered up more than they needed rotted and got filled with maggots. They had to learn to trust God. But they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it. When it came time to cross into the promised land, Moses had a representative of each of the tribes, the 12 tribes, go into the promised land to spy it out. And they did, and they came back. They came back with samples of the food, grapes bigger than any grapes you could imagine. They described it as a land flowing with milk and honey. And yet they said, we saw the people there. And we were like grasshoppers in our eyes and in their eyes. And the people listened and were scared. But a couple, Joshua and Caleb, said, wait, it's true we went in, and it is a land flowing with milk and honey. And it's true that we did see people who looked like giants. But if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will swallow them up. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. And yet we know the tragedy. The tragedy of a people who could not trust God. And for 40 years they wandered in that wilderness, learning to trust. And it wasn't until 40 years later that trust had been built to a point where under the leadership of Joshua, they could go in and possess the land. And how much Jesus wanted us to understand trust. To trust God. To look to God as our source, not ourselves, but to God. I think one of the problems that plagues us today is that so often, if not most of the time, we've looked upon ourselves and our abilities to get a job, our ability to make a living, and we look at ourselves, we look at whoever is responsible for the paycheck as the source. Not God, but men and things become our source. And we trust in them. And when those things get shaken, we get shook. There's an interesting story about a young married man. He wasn't young when he told the story, but he decided to go back to college and to finish his education. And he found out that the only job that he could get that would give him the time to earn the money for his family to live and the time for his college education was to sell brushes door to door. And he began to do that. And this is what he said. As long as my wife and I relied utterly upon God, there did not seem to be too much to selling enough to meet our needs, with some left over. Everything seemed to go quite smoothly. And then he got a wry smile on his face and he continued. He said, but you know, people, all of us, it isn't long before we begin to think that we are doing it. We begin to think that we are the experts at selling. And we begin to take all the credit for ourselves, for our success. In our times of prayer, instead of being a time when we were coming to God and looking to him as a source, they become more or less a perfunctory time, a time for tipping the hat to God and saying, good morning, God. See you later. And then he said, every time this happened, my selling went to pot. As far as I could tell, I was acting the same way. I was saying the same things, but I just wasn't selling. And then he said, for a while we began to think, well, maybe it had something to do with the day of the week or the day of the month. You know, something special about when you win, about paydays or things like that. Well, he said, but it soon became apparent with the passing of time that the time of month had nothing to do with it. And then when our finances got to the point where we were nearly broke, we always got down on our knees, literally on our knees, and prayed. And each time we were made to know exactly what was wrong. We had ceased depending on God and had slipped over into depending upon ourselves. He says, of course, we got back on the beam right away. And then each morning we would get down on our knees, for we knew that our source was God. And once more, I'd go out, and as far as I could tell, I said the same things. I did the same things. But there was a difference. I made sales. Isn't that interesting? Trying to tell us. Jesus was trying to tell us, as God tried to tell those Israelites, God is your source, not people, not government programs, not banks, not grain cartels, but God. And Jesus wanted us to understand that when we look to God as our source, God will see us through whatever the circumstances, whatever the difficulties, and bring us out on top. Oh, there's a couple little stories that are fascinating. A lot of stories I could tell, but time doesn't permit. I just want to tell you about Charles Capps. Charles Capps is a farmer from England, Arkansas. He sold a piece of property, got him $25,000 for it, invested it in a joint business venture, which went straight down the tube. And he got discouraged. Now, he'd been a very successful farmer up until that time. He was a cotton farmer. He could grow cotton. But from the moment that the thing started to go bad, he began to talk bad. He wasn't looking to God. He was seeing himself as the victim of every kind of situation you could imagine. He went out and he planted his field of cotton. He planted it 3 inches deep, and he says, now there'll probably be a flood come along and flood it all out. And it did. He planted his cotton again, this time a 1/2 inch deep, and said, now we'll probably have a drought. And there was. He planted it a 3rd time that year, and he said the same thing, except this time it started to come up, and he got about 2/3 of a crop, and he said, well, yeah, it came up, but it'll probably have a frost before it has a chance to do anything. I'll lose it. And he did. Not just 1 year, but the next year. I'm not sure how many times that happened, but he said that one day somebody left a book at his house called Right and Wrong Thinking. And he discovered that his thinking was all wrong. He had been looking to himself, he had been looking at his own ability, he had been looking at nature, and he had been talking negative about everything. He had that philosophy that said, whatever the worst is that can happen, it will. And it'll happen to me. But he said the moment he started to turn around his thinking, and the moment he began to look at God as his source, it changed. And a book he has written called The Tongue, A Creative Force is a fascinating book that he's written telling the story of what happened. And the reason he's written it is because, you know, once somebody starts getting a hold of something like that, they can't help but talk about it. And he talked. And people listened, and they began to do what he was talking about, and they saw the results. And of course, that's why it grew into a book and why he has become a very popular public speaker, because he's learned firsthand what can happen when you look to God at your source when everything around you says no. He tells about buying a piece of property that was not supposed to be possible. And yet God made it possible. And he goes on to relate the things that have happened since he's begun to look at God as his source and to bring into play positive words from his mouth. Not negative words, but positive. It's something that's hard for people to grasp and understand. And Jesus knew it, and he kept working on it over and over again as he talked to people. And he wanted us to understand. Trust God. God wants to help us have our daily bread. It is God's good pleasure to help us find a pair of lost scissors, to help us grow the kind of crops we want to grow. It is God's good pleasure. But until we look to God as our source, until we can vision God as being personally interested in us, personally interested, one-on-one, until we come to that point, it's not going to work. Because there won't be trust. And trust is the bridge between us and our need and God in his supply. Trust, Jesus said. When you pray, give us this day our daily bread. And trust him to do it.